welcome to this episode of Thaddaus Dawson Speaks, Liberation Through Valuation where Soul Meets Soil. Today, I am honored to have another one of my sheroes on the program, Dr. Wendy Mohammed out of Chicago, Illinois. She and I served on the physics panel just probably 3 or 4 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and she's got so many lists of accomplishments. Um, she's been honored nationally. She does business internationally. She's an author. She has a museum that she curates and has developed in Chicago. We're going to get into all of that, as well as talk about policy and some of the things that she's done locally in Chicago to change the landscape forever. So without further ado, Dr. Wendy Mohammed. Thank you, Wendy.
Hey,
I'm so
Darius.
and thank you for reaching out to me and following up. I know we were together a couple of weeks ago at the Physics Summit in Washington, D.C. So that was quite a time, and you shared quite a few things. Let's just jump into policy. One of the things that I've been we've been working on policy, and I've been going to different policy summits and across the country in participating. And what I found is in my space, uh, most people don't take the appraisal policy as serious or know as much about it as we should. And it underlies everything that we do. It impacts the gross domestic product. It impacts the national debt. Locally, it impacts property taxes. So for something that is so serious and so impactful, nobody really understands it. And so what we are going to do here is we are forming the 10,000 Appraisers National Appraisal Policy Resource Center, where we're not just talking about the problem, we're also bringing about the solution. So through our workforce development program and appraisal apprenticeship program, and the whole goal is to modernize the appraisal process. Now, you were in DC at the Physics Summit. Can you tell us what policy was important to you and what you were representing while you were there?
Well, I first want to thank you for inviting me onto the show. And one of the policies that I think I heard you speak the year before or last year as well, when you guys were talking about appraisals. And that struck me because as a real estate developer, I started out in real estate sales and moved into investment and developing. And I think this is important for all of us to pay attention to, and pay attention to what politicians support you on this matter, because wealth in America is based on investment pretty much in two different types of things: real estate and stocks. And in the real estate side, there's always been this inherent racism when it comes to real estate evaluations, purchasing opportunities, lending, neighborhood development. Very much in general, all of that system needs an entire revamp. And so, that was very important to me. I was representing some healthcare reforms that we're working on, but not so much on the side of the patient healthcare reform, but on the side of the business developer healthcare side, and some of the antitrust and anti-competitive acts that are in place that prevent a lot of Black entrepreneurs from being owners in the healthcare space. And so both of these issues fold together because, especially for me in the healthcare space, I like to make the development of those healthcare institutions also a real estate play. And so when people start playing with you with the valuation of your property and telling you where you can practice and what you can do and what you can't do, they're actually impeding on your ability to do business. And so those two issues were at the top of my list at the physics conference.
So one of the things that you hit upon was racism or bias in appraising. And for people of color in the community, all they understand is that the system has been set up against them and they have experienced bias. So over the last couple of years, people have been talking about appraisal bias to nauseam. But then the appraisers on the other side say that they're not being biased and that it's the comparable sales, it's the market, it's the school system, it's the healthcare system in close proximity. So the issue, underlying issue is all of the above is true. The problem is the appraisal community hasn't necessarily listened to the community that has been undervalued, and the undervalued community doesn't really understand the appraisal process. So what I have been able to do is listen, travel the country, and bridge the gap to be able to articulate it. So in that, what I have ascertained is that the system is broken. It's
Correct.
systemically outdated. So,
Correct.
and you being in Chicago, Chicago is the home of paired sales analysis, which was
Hmm.
established in 1933. Well, today is 2026, and that model just doesn't work.
Yeah,
So,
it's one of those old business models that no longer works. And then a lot of these appraisers that are in the game, you can tell they have no clue what they're doing outside of just checking a box. And in a case like Chicago,
it,
where you had the redlining that was happening during the time that the system was created, and then you dismantled the neighborhoods, and now you're bringing the neighborhoods back, you can't continue to use the same system to evaluate the neighborhood that you've been taken through all of these ups and downs and evaluating and reevaluating. It's just not fair. But it also is not just location driven. I know in Maryland, when we were working on a lot of commercial healthcare spaces, there's a true inherent bias based on color and who owns the facility.
you said a mouthful there. Um, I'm gonna back up and start with what you said first, then we'll get to the healthcare piece. So, in my presentations, I talk about redlining. I talk about the the different things that the government has impacted in the space. So, what happened was all of it is related to policy. So you talked about redlining. That's policy from the
Mhm.
FHA, and then you talked about breaking up the black community. Well, that's policy from urban renewal from the Federal Highway and Transportation Department, which broke
Mhm.
up over 1,260 black communities across the country. You further go on to talk. You didn't talk about drugs in the community, but that's been a determining factor and a downward impact, and that was determined by policy with the CIA dumping drugs into the black community in order to finance foreign wars. Then you go further on to talk about the USDA and FSA not giving loans to black farmers. That's policy. Then we look at the FBI destabilizing the black community. That's policy. If we look at the EPA, over 70% of black communities are environmentally contaminated. That's policy. So I kept, I knew all of these things, but speaking at all these different policy summits, it just dawned on me that there is nobody that really advocates for policy in the appraisal space. And why that's so significant is because just now, right now, for the first time in 40 years, we have the most significant appraisal policy legislation ever that will actually modernize the appraisal process. This is through the president's new executive order, which the new executive order promoting access to mortgage credit. And as a part of that, he has Section 6, which is appraisal modernization. So again, we talked about 1933, the current use of what's being done appraising. So much technology has come into play that we can utilize it in order to modernize the appraisal process through data science. using evidence-based, data-driven analysis. And the policies that were written just don't stand up today. I like to use the analogy of using your grandmother's rotary dial phone trying to stream. That's what the appraisal system is. So when you talk about the bias in appraising, and it's the name, and it's just how people are able to identify it, but it's totally systemic, and the system is totally antiquated and outdated. And the enforcement agency to bring accountability does not exist. So everybody was under the impression that it was the Appraisal Foundation. They have no enforcement authority. What they do have,
no oversight.
Yeah, they have no oversight, but then they're not an oversight body. What they're authorized through Congress is to put rules in place as far as appraisal rules with uniform standards of professional appraisal practice. So the
So
name.
Thaddaus, let me ask you a quick question. Sorry to interrupt you because this is burning my head. So in Section 6 of this new executive order, what changes do you think will begin to prevent some of what we are now calling biases or systemic biases, and what relief will we have?
That is a good question. So one of the things that it calls for is a national license. So one of the things that I presented last week to the Federal Reserve was how to actually modernize the process. The first step in that is establishing an authority that has enforcement power, and that would be the Federal Appraisal Enforcement Authority. That now we have something that has teeth that will further the bill to make it work. The second thing we need to do is reconsideration of value. This is a law that already exists through the VA, and it's the most comprehensive system that we have for wealth protection. It's a 3-tier system that the VA already offers, and it's the gold standard. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to adopt it. And then in that adaptation, that authority then goes under the Federal Appraisal Enforcement Authority. That's the most urgent thing that we can do. And why that's so necessary is because FHFA paper 2407 that was done in November, the most comprehensive appraisal study ever, spanned it over 8 years and started off with a set of 45 million appraisals, which they narrowed down to 1 million appraisals and 4 million comparable sales. And in that narrowing, the result was that only 10% of all appraisals utilized market conditions adjustments. And that's all people talked about was the 10%. I never heard anybody talk about the 90% that didn't utilize them. So that 90% is an abject and total systemic failure. That means appraisers are not trained to do the basic job function. Either they're not trained or they're just not doing it. Either way, the impact on Black people is profound. That's where you get the bias. So when people talk about bias, it's not as much bias as it is miseducation. So that is why we need an enforcement and an oversight authority. And the belief was that the ASC, the Appraisal Subcommittee, had authority over the Appraisal Foundation. Theoretically, they didn't have any enforcement authority. All they could do was make suggestions. So basically, everybody thinks somebody else is taking care of it. And at the end of the day, nobody is taking care of it. So these are the 5 pillars that I presented on at the Federal Reserve board meeting last week. So that
is this for both residential and commercial real estate?
So no, so that's another good point. That study only included residential. It didn't even get into commercial. So when you start looking at the impact and undervaluation in the Black community, one of the things that the study said was it disproportionately impacted Black people. Now, it impacted everybody with the failure rate, but the impact disproportionately impacts Black people. But that only covered the residential sector. That didn't talk about rural and farmland. That didn't talk about heirs property. That didn't talk about the Black church, the largest Black landholder in the country, being undervalued. So with those estimates and what I've been working on and figuring out is that loss annually is around $800 billion to $1 trillion. And why that's so significant is because right now we're going through the largest transformation of wealth in history, $106 trillion. Black people are only participating in less than 3 trillion of those dollars. That number should be closer to 15 trillion. What has impacted those numbers that way? Policy. So if we focus on
the valuation of the commercial properties, which impacts whether or not people invest in those communities. So sometimes we wonder why, especially in places like Chicago, you drive past and you just constantly see all these vacant lots. Not only do you have like one or two people that end up owning all these vacant lots in a particular ward, but then you also have the undervaluation of the commercial space. So when a person wants to go in there and open something, they can't get the value out of it to make it even make sense. And so, yeah, I would like to see that really robustly impacting the commercial side, because that's going to help us to bring back our communities. It's a reason why people go into the suburbs and open all these franchises and all of this stuff. Because if you get a franchise agreement, you can get a loan, you can go see venture capital people, you can, open up this space and then keep those businesses in the community in a sustainable way. But it's almost impossible unless you just decide you're going to go in and be a pioneer, which a lot of us are doing. But to go into our community and do these types of things has become challenging. And I would argue that while, yes, I believe the system is what supports the bias, but the bias is definitely there. And I think the bias is sometimes out front, especially when you start talking about, like in our case in Maryland, a $20 million facility that we built. And it's almost like you can sense the collusion when it comes to the valuation and the conversations with the bank and other people. And then you literally can go and make a comparison yourself between another facility within the same area, and then the valuation numbers don't even make any sense. So I think there's also this assumption that we're all dumb when it comes to real estate, and we're far from that in the Black community. So not that I would get on the stand or anything, but I would, because I think that, especially from a commercial standpoint, it hits really, really hard. And then they start to play us, Thaddaus, like, well, why are you even investing in that community? Why are you building that over there? Well, clearly because there's a need, and you can show them all the data of the need and all of that, but the valuation tends to still be super low. And then the support from the cronyism and the collusion that happens within the industry then to me becomes antitrust and anti-competitive behavior that we need to start filing lawsuits and basically busting these people out for these types of behaviors, instead of retreating with a low self-esteem, like, well, the system is this or that, and they don't want us investing in that area. No, let's start having some conversations about it. And maybe those conversations need to be in court. Maybe those conversations need to be in, don't use certain appraisals or certain banks. I think that there's additional things that we could do, but that commercial piece, while I realize that the residential is important, that commercial piece is really, really biased.
Oh, it's huge in access to capital and opportunity and everything else. And so again, with the codification of reconsideration of value, that and what we're asking for reconsideration of value is not just for residential, it's for all federal transactions, residential, commercial, and agricultural. So hopefully that would be mitigating some of the things that you are talking about and referring to. And the other piece is the reconsideration of value does not accuse the appraiser of bias, But what it does do is objectively ask them to be able to explain their work. And what most people aren't able to do is put together that argument. And as the system is currently constructed, the evidentiary responsibility is placed back on the consumer, which they are not appraisers. That's just like getting a diagnosis from the doctor and giving yourself your own second opinion. You're not equipped to be able to do that. And so with this Federal Appraisal Enforcement Authority, it goes back on the responsibility goes back on the agency or the appraiser or the institution. That's where it should happen now. And right now, it's complementary, and it should not be complementary. It should be a whole separate function. It's really kind of hard to police yourself, and that's what's been happening in the appraisal industry for the last 38 years, and that's why it is in the shape that it's in today. It needs to be modernized. It needs to be updated. Everything else has been modernized and updated except for the appraisal profession. So, and the impact that it has is devastating. And what you talked about as far as healthcare, I know you've developed a hospital. And one of the things that we actually looked at the policy summit, there was a long section that you participated in that talked about the disparities in healthcare. And so that is always amazing because, like you said, this thread is interwoven throughout society
Yeah.
historically, and it hasn't changed. And so, but what is going on now, in my opinion, is everybody is in trouble, and it's going to take everybody coming to the table, investing in self-sustaining mechanisms. So that if that's crowdfunding, investing in your own communities and commercial properties, and being able to recirculate those dollars cooperatively. But as we talked about before the show, most people are moving from a place of scarcity and fear, especially when it comes to funding and being able to speak up. So the
Yeah,
only
because
way,
and if I could speak to that, Brother Thaddeus, is because what begins to happen is the flawed appraisal system puts these predators in a position where they can either deny lending access because they already know it's and if they probably patent, and I know you are an appraiser professional, so they probably be padding pockets and doing all kind of stuff. Then you have these banks that use, and these lenders that use that as an excuse to steal commercial properties, to shut people out of business. And I've been in real estate development on the commercial side for a long time, and I've seen this happening consistently. And when Black entrepreneurs are under attack, especially in the healthcare space, the issue with your appraisal evaluation becomes part of a layered antitrust and anti-competitive conglomeration of affairs that is shutting us down in those spaces around the country. And so while I agree with you, and I agree totally with a lot of these things we talk about are very multifactorial. So I don't do a lot of binary thinking. I get it that it's complicated. I also would impress upon anybody watching the show that they support the politicians that are working with you and others to try to revamp the system. Make sure that you're writing and reaching out to your local representatives and telling them, look, get behind these bills. But at the same time, closed mouths don't get fed. So open your mouth. If you got to start taking people to court, if you got to start putting this stuff on blast, especially in the commercial space, because residential, I think it gets a little bit more attention. But people in the commercial space, we tend to kind of just be quiet and just let it slide.
well, again, because a lot of times people can mitigate it with putting in extra capital, but that's what is so impressive about the promoting access to mortgage credit. The Appraisal Modernization Act goes to one single license, which moves towards one single authority, and because we have to be active in policy. The very organization that was mandated through Congress to protect us has done anything but protect us. It has protected itself and grown exponentially by charging exorbitant fees to the appraisers. So I'm encouraging the appraisers, if you really want to this profession, you're going to have to fight for it. And this appraisal modernization is the perfect tool to allow us to be able to fight for it. And right now it's law. So if you go back a couple of weeks ago, the Appraisal Qualifications Board had a meeting. And in that meeting, the president of the Appraisal Foundation stated that actually she was hoarse because she had been lobbying legislators that the single license would take away power from the individual states, therefore being an unintended consequence, weakening the power of the states. That's exactly what needs to happen in order to modernize the process, to have a one uniform standard of professional appraisal practice. They also had a search or a study done that says there's one test across the country. So there is no need for 55 different municipalities to enforce this. So if everybody is doing their own thing and nobody has any enforcement authority, that's the recipe for disaster for what we have right now. And now is the time for Congress to move forward with basically it's already law under the Appraisal Modernization Act. We just have to put the infrastructure in place. And that's what I testified to. And that's what I have submitted to the public record. And that's what our policy center will be based on, is working on the policy. And the policy is for the people. I testified under consumer protection and safety and soundness. And based on this FHFA study, the current system has a 90% failure rating. So when you think that you haven't gotten a fair appraisal, you might be 90%. You got a 90% shot at being right. So that's the bully pulpit that I've been working on, and the one that we will continue to develop across the country. We don't just show up with talking about the problem. We also have the solution to the problem, which is workforce development through the Appraisal Land Grant Modernization Act. This is another act that I wrote. And what this does is it covers the whole landscape of America through the land grant institutions, which covers all 50 states and territories. So you have, I believe, 56 land grant institutions. You have 1890 land grant institutions, which are historically black. And you have 34 1994 tribal colleges. So we cover the whole fabric. And this is how we get that appraisal modernization to stand. Again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's taken us 38 years to get where we are. And as a part of that process and that 38-year experiment, fortunately or unfortunately, my experience predates that 1989 FIREA congressional mandate. But before that, prior to that, appraisers were able to keep 90% of all of their fees and have direct relations with their lenders responsible for their own.
Yeah, that's real obvious. The direct relationships are real obvious. Quick question. Where is the policy now? It sounds like you said it's law. Are you now lobbying for funding to be in place for enforcement and a system to be set up so that these reevaluations can take place? And if so, what is the likelihood that the budget would be put forth to begin to do some of these reevaluations? And then how do you prioritize what gets reevaluated?
So really it's a state of emergency if you have a 90% failure rating. So the law is the appraisal modernization. You still have to get there. What the Appraisal Foundation is lobbying against it as an unintended consequence. So I'm saying we need to lobby for it, but we also need to add some pillars to it to strengthen it in order to make it exist. The first pillar being the Federal Appraisal Enforcement Authority. So now you have a federal body with oversight to be able to enforce the rules. Secondly, reconsideration of value. That is to reconsider. And what you're reconsidering is when somebody goes to apply for a loan and they feel like they've been undervalued. Now you can take and look at what the undervaluation was. And then every time, there's been a lot of cases where there is no case. So, but still, even if there is no case and that is the case, that needs to be an independent authority that does that audit and monitors that. And then at least
Has
it
that
increases.
independent authority been funded, is what I'm asking.
No, it hasn't been funded. Nothing
Okay.
has been funded. This appraisal modernization, I'm assuming that Congress will have some funding for, but the goal is to let everybody know in their legislative districts that this is something that they want to support and that they want to improve it in order so they can be effective for everybody. And those are the things that I submitted to the public record along with a white paper in the process.
Okay.
So this is an opportunity to level the playing field and really modernize the appraisal process, which it grossly needs. And this is for appraisers across the country to be able to fight, as well as consumers, because it impacts the consumers in all those areas we talked about: business, agriculture, religion, residential. We lose $100 billion a year in heirs property. That's when the interest becomes fractionalized because you don't have a will or a trust, and the largest percentage of that goes across the southern states in the Black Belt, the 13 southern states, and over 70% of Black people do not have wills and trusts. But like you stated earlier, over 65% of Black people also, their wealth is in real estate. They don't have stocks and bonds. And so how that is being able to pass down generationally has been impacted as well. So again, it's about having conversations, education, and in the community we have a lot of taboos and things that we don't do. We don't talk about our business. We have to talk about our business, and we have to do it intergenerationally, and so that the next generation can be prepared.
Yeah, and I think there's some human and civil rights issues in there. I've had clients where two clients live across the street from each other in a subdivision where the homes are similar, almost identical, and the only difference in dollars is connected to how they look or what religion they practice.
Well, that shouldn't be the case, and that's a difficult
In
one.
many cases, it is.
I do not disagree with you, and I have traveled the country, and I've heard a lot of cases and a lot of instances and a lot of things that we have worked on, but in order to mitigate those, the first one would be the reconsideration of value. It's a 3-tier system that the VA uses that's extremely judicious and very fair. It's fair, first and foremost, to the consumer. And secondly, it's fair to the appraiser because it doesn't accuse him of bias, but it asks him to substantiate his work. But in doing that, you have to be able to articulate that argument objectively. And that's where I think the disconnect comes. We know that there is an undervaluation going on. We feel there's an undervaluation going on. It's just having the ability to be able to articulate the argument in appraisal speak.
Yeah. I would argue that there's a sizable amount of very intelligent Black people who are out here moving money, moving real estate, and moving property that can articulate very well what's happening and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. But that's neither here nor there. I think what's good is that you all are going at this, and it's going to be a multifactorial approach. And there's going to be a number of different layers that are impacted. And I think that this is an important layer.
This is a very important layer. The journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And right now, we don't have the first step. We don't have a federal enforcement authority. So our goal, first and foremost, is to establish that federal enforcement authority. And then that takes the evidentiary burden off of the consumer and places it back where it belongs, on the lender and on the appraiser. That's first and foremost. And there has been nobody out there fighting for that, for the community, or fighting for the appraisers. And I just happen to wear both hats, and this is a part of what we have or I have been tasked to do, and I want to jump into that real quick about what I have been tasked to do because you talked a little bit on your show yesterday about your responsibility and why you do what you do, and people ask you all the time. And I think that's where I feel like I learned more about you yesterday watching your show than I have over the last 3 years I've been following you. And you just talked about how your mother always encouraged you to think. And then you had that one faux pas moment where you swung back on her. And, you know, we happy you still here today to talk about that.
I'm lucky to be here.
But in that, I think you said that you all had established a bond and a line of respect that she always held you accountable and appreciated your tenacity and willingness to fight. And I would say my father did the same thing for me, and it wasn't enough for us to go back home and say what everybody else was doing. Well, what did you do different to change it? And that's a little bit of my frustration now that I see. If you go to a ball game or you go to a concert, they constantly got signs up saying "See something, say something." You know, here we have a whole industry that nobody has seen or said. Or there are. Let me take that back. There's been a lot of people that have seen and said and had a lot of frustration. So I have gotten a tremendous amount of support across race, color, religion, across the country, which I am very excited about. But sometimes when you're out there and you're the tip of the spear, you look out, you're the only one screaming. Sometimes you had to question your own sanity. But then at the
Well,
end of the day,
you already know there's that inherent distrust of the system. And we deal with that in healthcare all the time, where people's family members are discriminated against and not properly treated. And the family's like, well, who do I say? So who do I talk to? I've gone to the top institutions in the country to address this issue. This is what they're telling me. And so I like the fact that you all are putting in place this body that is a space where people can report things to. That's also part of the problem. And I'm all for creating those bodies, even within our communities, where we're funding action that can be taken against these people that prevent these biases that are harmful, or that not prevent, but that practice these biases that are harmful to our community. So at some point, there has to be some kind of body where people can go and tell this trusted information to, because there's always so much blowback. There's so much, and the industry talks and it's small. I can tell you so many stories of how certain institutions that people think they can trust, they can't be trusted.
well, that's a big one. I wrote today about public trust, and in the AQB, and anytime the Appraisal Foundation opens their mouth, they're talking about public trust. That's the main thing they stand on. But yet, still, they have a 90% failure rating. What can you trust about a 90% failure rating that significantly impacts everybody? So when we started this movement, it actually started in 2022 with a reconsideration of value case in Cincinnati, Ohio. That case was, I recommended it to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. They picked it up. They turned around and then recommended it to HUD. HUD turned around and recommended it to the Justice Department. It's still hanging out there at the Justice Department and HUD right now. But what happened is they ran an article in the New York Times, and people started calling me from all across the country.
Yeah, and also
And me
that
being
is,
me,
how are they defining public?
that would be a good question. Thank you for that.
Who is the
I'm gonna
public?
have to. What public are you? Because everything they do is circular and insulated. So maybe they're talking about their public. I don't know.
It's
But
like a
the
jury of
public,
your peers. Who are my peers? Who are you considering my peers? And if you're saying this is based on some form of public trust, then what public are you talking about? Are you talking about a certain demographic of people that can trust a certain demographic of trustees or trustors? What are you talking about? Are you
So
saying that?
you said a mouthful, Dr. Wendy. So if you look at USPAP is based on reasonableness, reasonably accepted by your peers. It doesn't talk about anything about accuracy. So if you got a profession that's doing 90% failure rate and everybody agrees, there you go. That's your circle of trust. That's who is agreeing with everything that you're doing. So you have made some really significant points that I hope you don't mind me borrowing and
No, I don't.
incorporating.
And I would argue this. I would argue that when you start talking about public trust, how you define public makes sense. And if this practice that you're using is from 1933 or earlier, well, that was probably at a time where people look like you and I were not considered part of the public. So it's trusted among those people, which is why the banks oftentimes are in cahoots with the appraiser and the big time real estate developers sweeping through the community, buying up this stuff, getting these valuations, because we're not considered in their concept of trust.
Ooh, I'm gonna have to use that one too. That's another part of policy and what the policy was at the time. And again, that's why it's so important to modernize the policy for today. And the appraisal industry is going back for the past 38 years. So this current system has been in place since 1989. And again, with the appraisers at that point getting 90% of their fees, now it's a race to the bottom for fees and survival. And appraisers are probably getting less than 50% of the fees, probably more like 45%. And then the profits that are being made off the appraisers' backs alone is really part of the reason that you can't afford to get into the business. The entry is so high and the return is so low when you have existing appraisers that just aren't well trained. So I think
because at a 90% error rate, Brother Thaddaus, you shouldn't be getting 45% of your money. Maybe you just need to be getting 10% since you're wrong 90% of the time.
So you say with the 10% acceptance rate, you only get 10% of the money?
You should just get 10%. Can't nobody trust what you're doing anyway. You're really stealing. You're stealing time. If I know that I give you 10 appraisals and 9 of them going to be wrong, you just said that yourself. So
wow, I didn't even look at it like that. 9? But again, a lot of it is
business owner. So should I be paying you for those 9, or should I just pay you for 1? Since 9 times out of 10, you just said that 90% of them are wrong. So what you're doing is you're really stealing. You're a thief. You're coming in here, you're taking people's money, and I got a 90% chance that if I pay you $1,000 or $1,500, or it comes out of my closing or whatever, I got a 90% chance that you're going to be wrong.
So are you saying but you're holding the appraiser accountable? Yes, I'm holding the institution accountable because they didn't train the appraiser properly.
They're both accountable. Because a lot of times these appraisals, a lot of times this stuff ain't making no damn sense. But you don't even try to add any additional data points to make it make sense. You are a thief, and the institution you work for is a thief, because I already know if I give you my money, I'm not going to get a product. You're wrong 90% of the time.
That's why we have to codify reconsideration of value across all property types. You emphasize commercial. And if we use it on all federal related transactions, it's the number one tool in mitigating loss of wealth preservation. So
yeah, but that isn't all real estate some form of federally regulated transaction? What do you mean? Just if you get a federal loan? Because
if you get any kind of loan, they're usually federally backed. So that would go across. But sometimes there's private funding and private financing. You got many different ways to do it.
Yeah, people with these big commercial institutions, they using VCs, they using private lenders, they're using investment groups, all of this kind of stuff when they come in. So they're not mostly federally backed. That
is a start.
Federally regulated.
We have to start somewhere. So we have to start with the Federal Appraisal Enforcement Authority. right now there is no enforcement authority anywhere. The only place where this even exists is in the Veterans Administration. And the Veterans
Mhm.
Administration actually has the gold standard when it comes to consumer lending and appraising, in my opinion, because first and foremost, they protect the veteran above all else. And then
Mhm.
secondly, they protect the appraiser. And to your point, appraisers have pretty much been traumatized because if you don't go along with the lender and the folks putting that institutional pressure on you, you're out of business. So you are, like you said, you are already essentially stealing, getting a 45% fee for something that has a 90% failure rating.
That don't even make good business sense. It's really dumb. Whoever, I mean, and no one, and you can't tell me that these high end business people that are building these large, I'm talking about commercial now, these large multi-million dollar facilities are not seeing this and have not figured out how to mitigate this. So something else is going on because you got the public and then you got the public, I put in quotes. I think you got two different publics happening here.
Well, you bring up some very interesting points that I hadn't even really thought about and looked at. But again, in this space of policy, all of that's critically important, and it's going to take the public to get together, and it's going to take the public to solicit their legislators in order for this to happen, but also for some more things in giving it strength. So again, there's a certain level of education and awareness, but then there's also a certain level of legislation and administrative things that need to happen in order for these types of policies to advance. So I really appreciate your feedback and your perspective, which has been very refreshing and eye opening. So, with that being said, you got anything else you want to say before we close out this segment?
No, I this is something I think that's very important, and I'm while y'all doing that, I think we need some kind of subsystem that we start to put together that has people we should be doing business with, people we should not be doing business with, people we should be working with, and those that we should not be doing business. Because you got some of these appraisers that just go throughout the neighborhood with this 90% error rate, and we just keep using them over and over again. We need some kind of database in our communities that says these are the more reliable ones. They might be within this 10%. And these are the more reliable lenders. And here's a manner in which you can begin to report when people are trying to put you out of business, this antitrust, anti-competitive behavior. And if you are in a residential space where you're living right across the street from somebody and the valuations are starkly different based on how you look or how you practice and call God, then we need a separate database where we put that together and start reporting this, whether it goes to the press or we, like the old school green book.
Well,
While y'all
again,
working on that other thing over there that needs to get funded.
that is something that is definitely doable, and they supposedly have something in place like that right now. But whatever is in place right now has not been effective. It clearly is not working, and now more than ever is the time for change. And again, the appraisal modernization section of access to housing credit, promoting access to mortgage credit program is the opportunity. So that is going to be imperative that everybody push for its acceptance, and then we kind of work from there and build the foundation in order to scale the program.
Makes
So with
sense. I
that,
definitely think it's multifactorial.
again, I think I'm gonna use multifactorial too. If you hear me regurgitating that, don't be upset. I'll
That's
give you
all
a
right.
little,
That's what I'm here for. I told you
So
I'm a
again,
global thought leader. I'm gonna help you think through these things so that here's part of the challenge, Thaddeus. Even sometimes the way we fight has been systemic systemically set up against us. And so sometimes we have to introduce additional thoughts into the equation because we're fighting in the manner in which they told us to fight. And so sometimes we got to know strategically, what moves we need to make that may or may not be part of the system on how to fight. And so I think more conversations like this, that's why I'm grateful that you brought me on and that we're talking about it. So more conversations like this need to be had so that we can then begin to figure out a solution that is happening concurrently with the policy changes that you all are working on. Because what we don't want to do is put all our eggs in the policy basket, and then you get down the line, maybe another administration or maybe the funding never gets to that oversight body. And then we're still holding the bag after investing all these time and hours. So we need some concurrent movements happening.
I agree totally. And that's why the name of our organization is the 10,000 Appraisers National Appraisal Policy and Resource Center. We don't only want to just talk about the policy, we want to be the resource for change as well. So being the resource and having the flexibility and adaptability is one of the things that we've been able to make a big dent in the progress. Our birthday is when we'll be making the official announcement, and I hope that you'll be here for our opening policy summit here in June 19th and 20th here in Atlanta. So I'm expecting to see you here.
I will do what I can. I think this is very important. And I think that if we get these concurrent forces going, we can really make an impact in the ability to invest in our communities, because many of our communities around the country are blighted. And it's because you have these predators who have been able to become part of a system that continues to take advantage of the blighted nature in our community. If we begin to fix these commercial evaluations, then the real estate, the residential is going to follow. Because now you got, companies that are able to come into your community and open restaurants, open grocery stores, do business in the community. It's clear we got the money.
Yeah, that is clear, and it is, and I like everything that you said as an opportunity, from a community standpoint, but also from an appraisal standpoint. Again, the majority of these things that we see happening is a result of miseducation. They haven't been taught, and like you said, some of it is still going to be racism or bias. You're going to have that, but according to that FHFA paper, if you start with the market conditions adjustments, you could mitigate almost 70% of that.
Yeah, you can. And I worked with a company in West Sub-Saharan Africa that builds cities. And when you first build a city, the first thing you do is you start with the school. So if you got a brand new city or a brand new community, you're going to need to build schools. So now we're talking about how are you valuing those commercial properties that become the school. If in our community you're consistently undervaluing them, then it makes it less attractive for educational investors, if you will, to come into the community, or members of the community to acquire these larger properties to open a school. Then the next thing you start looking at is manufacturing, or some way and method in which a person should employ themselves. Okay. Now, again, if you're talking about manufacturing plants, if you're talking about warehouses, you're talking about businesses that are being housed somewhere, warehousing, whatever it is. Again, we're looking at valuations. How are you going to evaluate that property so that the person knows if it makes sense to even put their equipment there that they're delivering, or their grocery store or whatever. After you're talking about that, now you get the jobs and stuff open. You're talking about healthcare. These are the pillars of building a community or a city. Now you're talking about healthcare. Again, facility driven. Even if doctors start going back to home visits, you still got to have somewhere to have your surgery or your radiological services. So where is that facility? How is it being valued? Because if you don't get the building valuation right, then you can't access the commercial equipment valuations properly. Can't get the venture capital or the money you need. No one's going to want to lease you the equipment. So you're going to have to be very capital heavy to go in and buy that surgical equipment or whatever it is that you need to run that business. And then now you have those anchors set up, grocery stores, same concept. Now you have those anchors set up, and then you go in and say, okay, now we're going to start building the houses. So again, very multifactorial.
Yeah, and that development infrastructure you laid out worked across just about every community. So we looked at that model for rural community and rural development, and I think rural development, there is a big opportunity there as well, because you need to have food sovereignty. And I always talk about, you can't work on wealth development when your belly is touching your back. You focusing on the day to day, and so increasing that is also an opportunity that we talk about and work in that space. But again, thank you for coming on to the show. I want to get on to our next segment. For those of you out there, this is Thaddaus Dawson Speaks, Liberation Through Valuation, where soul meets soil. Our guest today was Dr. Wendy Muhammad out of Chicago. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you again, Dr. Wendy, for coming on to the show.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Moving, don't get left behind. Preserve the well.